Thank you very much for that introduction. I usually, when I give a public speech at this point, if they've read the full biography and it's all entire horror, try and reassure the audience that no matter how hard I try, I cannot be as boring or grim as that makes me sound. I can't say that tonight. This is a very grim subject. I probably have a reputation sometimes as a faintly humorous speaker. You bring Craven on between the dessert and the dancing elephants. There's nothing funny about the situation we find ourselves. Indeed, I've never faced a more serious topic in my life. And I remember when Eamon asked me to give this speech, I have to say Vice-Chancellors don't lack invitations to give boring speeches. This was a speech I said to my office that I would do whenever it had to be done, because there is no issue more serious than the one we face tonight. And the reason that I say that is because really what I'm going to say tonight is that we face a crisis in the protection of conscience in relation to healthcare, a crisis that can spread beyond abortion into all sorts of areas of healthcare, and beyond healthcare into a whole variety of contexts of conscience, and we have to do something. And we have to do it quickly, and it worries me. I know that in this room, and I rejoice in the fact that there are many more people than merely those who are Catholics, but to the extent that this is a Catholic problem, it is a characteristic of our church that we are slow to react to external crisis. So that's the theme I'm giving you tonight, that this is a crisis, that something has to happen. And what I'm going to say to you tonight is going to try and be as practical and theoretical as possible. Now, I think we all understand the nature of a right to conscience. I'm not going to pursue that terribly philosophically. We know that it's recognised in all the basic human rights instruments. We know it's closely related to religion, although I would make the point that the right to conscience goes well beyond the right to religion, and people who are entirely non-religious have a conscience and have a right to that conscience to be protected. It's more than mere opinion. The reality is that the right to conscience is the right not to be constrained against your moral precepts, and it's worth asking and remembering the basis of that right. The basis of that right is the right of every person to an individual personality. Because if a person cannot act on their basic moral precepts, they are not a person. A person who does not have a right to conscience has been denied their right to individuality. And I have to say, as a Victorian, as a person born in Victoria who lived here for the first 40 years of my life, was then exiled to Western Australia and finally sort of transported to New South Wales, it is a matter of great shame to me that my home state is such a negative exemplar in this respect. Because it is beyond any question that Section 8, in particular of the Abortion Law Reform Bill, is fundamentally opposed in any philosophical, legal or internationally legal sense to freedom of conscience. In that it requires people to cooperate in what they perceive as morally evil through the process of reference, but also in such matters as requiring cooperation in relation to so-called emergency abortions. And note also that it does not only apply to that category of health practitioner who are doctors. It applies well beyond that in relation to nurses. I think the vital point here is that that concern about conscience and individuality goes well beyond being a Catholic. It goes well beyond being religious. It goes well beyond the issue of abortion. This is not primarily a Catholic issue or a religious issue, and fundamentally, and I'll come back to this, it is not an issue about abortion. This is an issue about conscience. And because it's an issue about conscience, it is infinitely generalisable. The precedent comprised in this legislation can be used, and I use the next word consciously, rape the conscience of anybody on anything. And that is how the debate has to be run. Now, I have the greatest sympathy for health practitioners in this context. The reality is that this issue of conscience It arises in particular issues in health that are terribly acute: abortion, euthanasia, so on and so forth. I reflect that I am very glad that as a young chap I had absolutely no scientific or mathematical ability, and therefore was never faced with the prospect of being a doctor. In thinking of this, I've reflected that as a lawyer and as a public lawyer, I've never been faced with something like this. I've never been faced with a law that required me to breach my conscience. Even when as Crown Counsel I had to deal with the formulation of laws about prostitution regulation and equal opportunity, I was always able to make sure that those laws followed particular types of precepts. So it is astonishing to me to see what you are faced with. I would like to say I have nothing but admiration for you, but I also have the deepest sympathy for you. And I'll be honest with you, I look inward on myself with the gravest fear as to how I would react if I was faced with the problem that you face. I mean, I think it really calls all of us to think, gee, what would we do if we were faced with the might of state against our conscience? Now, I don't propose to rehearse the context of Section 8 of the Abortion Law Reform Act, but I will say a few things about it because it's important to this debate. It is appallingly drafted technically. If I'm going to draft a law for abortion, I can do a hell of a lot better than this. You would normally assume that a section like this was never intended to pass, that it was either put in there, as was said, as a bargaining chip, or in a symbolic way to rub the noses of opponents in it. And you would certainly assume that it was never intended to be enforced, that once it was on the books, it would be largely ignored. It's a section with multiple unclarities. By way of example only, it's totally unclear what referring means. It's totally unclear what knowing a medical practitioner who does not have a conscientious objection means. It's equally unclear what on earth an emergency necessary to save a woman's life means. All of those things normally would be clear and defined in a piece of legislation. It is therefore absolutely clear that this unclarity reflects a deliberate inadvertence to certain facts. The fact that anybody who wants to find an abortion can walk down to an internet cafe within 100 yards of here and find one. That has been mentioned, you don't get referred for an abortion, and indeed the reality around the so-called emergency circumstances of abortion. The conclusion you get there is this: most bad legislation creates a problem by accident. This bad legislation was designed to create a problem. That's the reality, and that's what we're dealing with. It's the intended effect. This is deliberately coercive. It is deliberately symbolic of a victory in a particular respect, and it is indeed a fundamental issue of human rights. Now, everybody says that everything is a fundamental issue of human rights. I remarked in another place that a human right is an ambit claim of a good PR agent. This is one of those cases where it's absolutely unarguable. Every human rights instrument includes the right to freedom of conscience. Section 116 of the Constitution, the Commonwealth Constitution, has the right to religion. As we know, Section 14 of the Victorian Charter actually has the right to conscience. It's always regarded not only as a right, as a fundamental right. And so the first question you have to ask is, why in Victoria have we, and I reconsider what I said about Victoria, as a proud New South Welshman I say you, why have you set out to trample this right? Now, I think we have to accept that the context of abortion is critical. We have to accept that abortion is a deeply emotive issue on both sides and attracts people of principle and goodwill to both sides of the debate. That's true. I think we know that we have widespread public acceptance of abortion, at least in particular circumstances, and I think we know, and I certainly know from my experience in Western Australia, that the debate trying to stop abortion has in so many respects been lost. But I think the thing that really stands out about this legislation in terms of explaining it is that this really was meant to be a touchstone of a symbolic victory over conservative forces. It is set there like a statue. And for conservative forces, read religious forces, that it has that intention. And I think the difficulty we face that in terms of the human rights debate, it's always said about human rights that the test of human rights in a society is, do they protect the most marginalised, the least respected, the least popular members of that society? And normally when we say that, we think of refugees and we think of sexual criminals. But unfortunately in this context, there is no point pretending that doctors with a conscientious objection are anything other than to their opponents the least popular, the least deserving of protection, and the most marginalised in that respect. And I think that says something about the human rights debate. Many years ago I used to think that the idea of human rights was neutral. It's not. The human rights industry, and there is an industry, is programmed on basically a particular version of a particular left-wing political program, and those rights are designed to vindicate that program. And in that battle, the right to religion and the right to conscience finishes nowhere. In actual fact, the right to religion and the right to conscience is conceived of as a threat to rights, and that is reflected in this legislation. Now, you might ask, how have we got to that point? And I think you have to reflect on the position of religion and conscience in Australian political culture. Because the reality is, having a right to conscience, and I was talking to Nick Tonti-Filippini about this, and having a right to religion ultimately depends upon a prevalent consensus in society that religion is a thing that's good and worthwhile having, and that conscience is a thing that's good and worthwhile having, and that base has been deeply eroded. It's been eroded for many years by things like indifference, by things like hostility to any attempt to impede particular agendas, right, wrong or indifferent, in relation to abortion, same-sex marriage and so on and so forth, by a culture of libertarianism. But I would have to say, in our present context, there is no greater problem in relation to these types of issues than the child sexual abuse. That those who wish to go in a particular way in relation to abortion are deeply conscious that the credibility of the same people who oppose this type of legislation has been undermined by that tragic failure in that respect. And that is something that we're going to have to deal with. But to return to my theme, all of those things tell us that this situation is dire. Not only have I talked about the unclarity of the legislation, not only could I talk about the malice of this legislation, but that is reflected in what we now begin to see in terms of the application of the legislation. The same lack of concern for conscience, the same deliberate confusion about terms, and the same ideological determination in the application of the legislation of the two doctors as occurred in the formulation of the legislation. And the crucial question is, what the hell do we do now? And I'd really like to stop at this point, but I really can't. So I'll sort of do my best. The only logical strategy, it seems to me, is one that is not going to depend on a sudden change of heart by the people who put this legislation in. That's not going to happen. Inevitably, the only strategies that work are legal and political strategies, and they're going to have to overlap in the most sophisticated type of way. And the starting point I'd make about this is to repeat what I said before. This must be a debate about conscience that appeals to the fears of any decent person in this society, of whatever background, who fears that once the principle that anybody can't have a conscience has been established, then that person can't have a conscience, even if they disagree with everybody in this room on every single thing. Because, be aware, we will lose any debate framed in terms of abortion, but we can win a debate framed in conscience. Now, what could we do? Well, I've got a number of options here, a number of which just sort of dismiss themselves. Option one, I had always hoped with this that the law would not be enforced. And that was a plausible position because it was so bad and so badly drafted and so obviously a breach of human rights. Well, maybe you just give up and go away. Well, that's not happening, is it? We know that that's not happening. So, option two.